Today is June 1st, 2011. I am Jim Burch, a friend of Ken Maley, who we're interviewing today about the New Testament. We're in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, to dedicate ourselves to this book and to talking about it. So Ken, you have scribed, written the New Testament, but you don't consider yourself to be the writer of it. First of all, how did the New Testament come to be?
Well, it all began, I guess, originally in the mid-90s. St. Paul came to me and asked me to help him get the things that were not really revealed, that weren't inspired out of his writings, and I just couldn't handle that. And then in 2001, when I was making a long retreat in the desert, Jesus came to me and asked me if I would redo the New Testament. I thought that was a good idea, but I thought that I wasn't the person for that, and I made a few feeble attempts and then, quite frankly, forgot it.
Before we go on, was that a surprise that Paul and Jesus would come to you? Did you feel surprised at that?
Very surprised, wondering if I had finally gone completely crazy. And yet, on the other hand, it seemed real. A friend of mine, who is a shaman and quite wise, was with me one day, and I said, I have a part of me that feels that Jesus is talking to me and a part of me that feels I'm delusional. And she said, which part is bigger? And I said, the part that feels it's real. And she said, then it's real, which I found quite interesting.
Yeah. So then, I'm sorry I interrupted your chronology, so what happened after that?
In 2001, I made a long retreat in the desert, and as I had mentioned, Jesus came to me and asked me to redo the New Testament, and I thought it was a crazy idea, but a good idea that I could easily forget. My philosophy has always been there's no problem too big you can't run away from it, and so I ran away from it by simply forgetting it. And then in 2009 he came to me again about the same topic, only this time he took it in bits. He said, would you rewrite John 14 to 17? And I've always really loved that part of John, and so I said yes, and I wrote it out, and the next day I read it and I thought, this is really good. And he said, well, let's do all of John that isn't historical parts. And so I did that, and then he said, let's do all of John, and I did that, and then he said, why don't we just do the whole New Testament? And I said, okay, and then I started working on it, and I would work on it almost every day. Sometimes what I was hearing was so different that I couldn't write it down. It just seemed beyond where I could go at the time, and so I would take a few days and think about it and pray about it and ask him again and ask him again, and then I would write it out. He always wins in the end, but he's very patient. He lets you work at it at your pace.
How long did it take?
I started in September of 2009 and ended somewhere around July of 2010. So a little less than a year.
Must put a lot of hours per day in to do that, because the New Testament is itself pretty powerful and fairly long, and the rewriting must have taken some time.
Well, I did it I wrote it by hand the first time. I found that was the best way to do it, because sometimes sometimes I would miswrite something, and sometimes, quite frankly, I wouldn't hear correctly. It's hard to explain this part, but when Jesus asked me to do the whole New Testament, he said that he promised that all of the other authors, or all the authors of the New Testament, would work with me to rewrite it. And there was a group. There was generally four. There was Jesus, there was John, who has been my spirit guide since '96. Solomon was there, and the author...
Solomon, the king from the Old
Yes,
Testament?
the king from the Old Testament.
What did he have to do with the New Testament?
Just brought wisdom to everything.
Huh.
And there would be the author that I was working with. And they would sort of sit up on a dais, and I would look at them, and they would say whether or not what I had put down was right, and if I ever had a question, should I use this word or this word, they would indicate which I should write. And so that took a little longer, and if I had not written it correctly the first time, I could correct it as to what they wanted put in there. And if I wrote it and I looked at them and they thumbs up, then I would go on, and if it thumbs sideways, I would figure out what they wanted changed, and thumbs down, I just start over. Sounds a little strange, but that's the way it happened for months and months.
Most of us have no concept, so you're filling in an empty bucket here.
Then, of course, I had to type it out, and then I had to start editing it, and that's why it's taken so long. And quite frankly, I've been resistant to publish it because a lot of people are not going to understand. But the people that I have shared it with, those who read it, liked it, loved it. Some of the people that I told about wouldn't even read it because they thought it was either delusional or satanical. Those were the two.
Well, previews of coming attractions, huh?
Yes, and I figured at some point I'm going to be considered delusional or led by the devil, or perhaps both.
Certainly by a certain segment of the population,
Yes.
anyway, and
Yes.
you're prepared for that.
I'm prepared. As I reread it, I realize it's really from Jesus. I couldn't have written that.
Yeah, that's how I felt when I read it. I mean, I know you, and you write beautifully, and you have beautiful thoughts, but this is beyond what we human beings could put together, and put together so cohesively.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you were getting this information from these people, did you hear voices, or was it just voiceless voice? Were you able to distinguish a male voice from a female voice, for example, or that it was Jesus versus Solomon's voice? Was there a tone of voice, or did you just hear telepathic type of words and messages?
It was sort of a mixture. There were times when it was sort of like automatic writing. The words would come and I would just write them down. There were times when it would come as I would call it a feeling revelation. I would know something was true that I didn't know before, and then I would have to go through putting that into words. And sometimes it was me sort of feeling through the energy to get to the words. And sometimes, and particularly with Paul, I could hear him talk. Paul, who wrote so much of the New Testament and had so much to change. We worked together for months on it.
Yeah.
He was so grateful. because he knew that what he wrote, part of it was very inspired. The last, what they call the prison epistles, are beautiful, but some of the other things are crap. I mean, they're just Pharisaical bleed-ins to what Jesus taught. He told me that his conversion to Jesus on the road to Damascus was instantaneous, but he was so steeped in Pharisaical, Mosaic law that it took him decades to get out of that, and never fully got out of it till he died and was on the other side, where he and Jesus could talk more easily, shall we say.
Now, how did it happen that initially, and then as time went on, that you made this contact? Do you do it in meditation? Are you kind of, I guess you have to have your eyes open to write and all that sort of thing. So is this like a presence you can put yourself into, and it's easier now that you have begun it? Or I'm sure I'm not asking that question well, but maybe you get the context of what I mean.
Yes, and some of these things I just don't understand. One major event that helped was Christmas morning of 96. I got up to go to the bathroom, came back, laid down, was reading something. And at that point I had 3 Chihuahua dogs, and they were in different parts of the house. And there was this huge noise that came. And the dogs at both ends of the house heard it. So it wasn't simply me imagining something, and they started barking. And I remember sitting up on the bed and saying, if I really believed in the devil, I would believe he had just come into my house. And I thought about that, and then I said, but that's not true. What happened wasn't at all negative. It was just so powerful. And I had been told by a very gifted person that my spirit guide had a Chinese connection. And I saw a glimpse of a bear coat, and I knew my spirit guide had come.
This was not John, or it was John?
Well, interestingly, when this began, I was given the name of Shen, which is a Chinese name. And that morning, he began to speak to me, and he told me who I was in the time of Jesus. And that just, it just destroyed me in some sense. And I never doubted it, but I had nowhere to put what I had been told. Mm-hmm. My mother was in the hospice unit, and my brother was in town, so I had to go there and said Mass with them. And then she went to bed, and he went home. And I remember walking in this courtyard, saying, what do I do with this? And sometime earlier, I had met a friend of Edgar Cayce, and she had given me all of her books on Edgar Cayce when she left her house to go into assisted living. And I had dutifully put all these on the shelf and had never read them. So at this point, I need to read something. My conservative Catholic theology had no place to put a spirit guide. And so I began my search to understand this. And I began every day to sit down, and I would write on the typewriter what I had heard. And through the months, I was told that Shen was actually John the Evangelist.
In another lifetime? Or?
Another lifetime, yes, exactly.
And did you appreciate that reincarnation theology at that point, or did that come through the Edgar Casey readings?
A little of both, and the other books that I had, and teachings.
Yeah.
Jesus would try to enlighten me because there were so many things happening that were way beyond.
I find recognition of reincarnation in the Gospels, but I don't know if that's intentional.
It is. I mean, it's very obvious. Who do people say that I am?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how?
And who was this man? How did this happen? Was this man born blind? Is it his fault or his parents?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. I mean, once we take off the box, light gets a lot brighter. And even until this day, things are being revealed to me. Has happened with your question about Luke and the discrepancy on Peter.
Which leads me to ask, so Jesus is not trying to be, or is he, thoroughly comprehensive, clean up all the debris, or it's just he wants to get some essentials across, knowing that the way we speak about things in time always changes, and that this may need a freshening up in another 100 years or so?
I think it comes from Jesus's being gentle with me. And I think the fact that it's evolved is the fact that my openness has evolved. Jesus will work with me and us wherever we are. Occasionally he will give us a kick in the pants, but generally, if we believe something, he will accept that, because he is the truth. It's not dogma or logic or words that's the truth. So as long as we're dealing with him, truth can be different, and that's why I don't get upset with people who don't believe me. They have a right to believe their truth, and as long as they relate to their divinity, it all makes sense to me.
Do you sense that Jesus accepts that he knows everyone will ultimately be perfection, so he's not concerned about the timeline? Is there an element of that you think, how Jesus understands people and honors people?
I think he believes that we are all already perfect.
And we're in the process of experiencing it in this life?
Yes, of discovering the fact that we are perfect, that we are God. His main teaching is that we are God. Maybe I should explain a little about that. In the late 80s, I read a book on John's Gospel that said John's Gospel is a chiasm, and after a long search, I found out that a chiasm is a literary technique popular in the time of Jesus, where the author puts the main point exactly in the middle of the narrative, and then around it, like an onion, puts things that point back to it. And when I read that, I said, well, what would this mean with John's Gospel? And through math, you get to the exact center of John is John 22. 21 chapters divided is 10 and a half. And in John 22, we have a narrative begins that has Jesus in the temple, and it says it is cold, which means that people don't understand well that they're not warming up to the true message that he has. And then it says he's walking in the portico of Solomon, which is symbolically saying what's going to be said is extremely important. It's very wise. And then there's the interplay with the delegates from the chief priests asking him if he's God, and he says, yes, I'm God, but you don't believe me, and they pick up stones to kill him, and he says, I've done a lot of nice things for you folks. For which of these nice things do you want to kill me? Which I think is wonderful, that they're threatening to kill him, and he's joking with them. They don't get the irony at all. And then he says in 10:34, does not your scripture say you are God's? And when I read that, I thought, that makes everything sense. Makes sense of everything. His main teaching is that we are God. Earlier, I had discovered in John 2, the wedding feast at Cana, John's Eucharist. I'd always wondered why in the Last Supper there's no Eucharist, coming from the Catholic tradition where the Eucharist is a central act of worship. How can you forget it? And I somehow knew that it was in John, but it took me 3 decades to find it, and it was in not the Last Supper, but the First Supper. There are a lot of things in John that says you got it backwards, folks. Like the last meal in John is not the Last Supper, it's the first breakfast. You know, it's just, it's extremely well put together. John told me that the scholars who have found that there are different ways of speaking in John comes from the fact that the members of his community each wrote what they wanted in it, and then they as a community got together under his leadership and put together this chiasm. So, the scripture scholars are right. There are differences in there. And John oversaw it, but didn't write absolutely everything that was in it. And obviously over John was Jesus helping put everything together. And that's why John's gospel is so different from the other 3. John had been able to escape from the Mosaic law and into the main teaching of Jesus, that we are divine. And because of that, his gospel is so very different.
And as you know, the way of speaking of Jesus in John is so different from the synoptic gospels that many people say that's not Jesus speaking in John, but it is Jesus speaking, or it is Jesus' thoughts enunciated through John in a new way?
I would
How
say,
would you say that?
The reverse. I think Jesus speaks in John, but not in some of the synoptic verses. Like when he says, "You whitened sepulchres," Jesus doesn't speak that way. I'll just say it. 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I was talking to a friend about the history of the New Testament, of the New Testament, and how the person who really determined the canon of the New Testament was not the church or church leaders, but Constantine, because when he ordered the 50 copies of the Bible to be handwritten, it was the largest order of books ever in the history of the present world, and it became the norm by default. And I said, it's interesting that Constantine has never appeared to me. A lot of the famous people in history have come to me and talked to me about this or that, but I never had him come. I am far from perfect, and so my feelings toward him have not been the most positive. But the next morning he did come to me, and he said, just straight out, he said, "You're exposing my sin." And I took a deep breath, and what was fascinating about that experience was that Jesus was there, and Jesus was reserved. I've never seen him like that. Because he realized how much Constantine had screwed up his message.
You think it was just letting Constantine get it off his chest, or
yes,
giving Constantine the option, the ability to feel that he wanted to let that be known and be forgiven for it?
Yes, and to go beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus said something interesting. He said, we all have a role to play, and Constantine was to do that so that in this age, this present age, the sort of boomerang effect of people realizing we need to look at things very differently. You know, we read the New Testament, and part of it is absolutely and totally inspired, but part of it just makes us feel bad.
Yeah.
And why would something that God said make us feel bad? Some people would say because we're dirty, rotten sinners. I don't happen to believe that. I believe we make mistakes. I believe we need to live differently than we often do. But for us to believe that God gets upset with that is arrogant. I had a home once in Tucson, out in the country, and the air there is so crisp that you can look up and just see billions and billions of stars. And I remember sitting there and thinking, for me to believe that an act of mine would screw up the God of this cosmos is really arrogant.
Mm-hmm.
To think that God would want to help me be more the God that I am, that works. But the other just
And the whole
doesn't.
concept that you hear often that we are thwarting God's will.
Oh, yes.
Can't be done.
Yes, and the idea that our sins are bigger than His love is just crazy.
And unforgivable.
Yes, recently a person who has accused me of being both delusional and satanic,
A twofer.
a twofer. I asked him, which one of your children would you condemn to eternal hell because of what they've done? I thought it was a good question, and he fudged with it.
Mm-hmm.
And said, who are my children? You know, but I think any parent who could think of condemning their son or daughter to eternal hell has to be sick themselves. And I think 99.9 of them, if they really looked at that question, who would I condemn to hell? None of their children.
Mm-hmm.
Because no matter what they've done, they're still loved.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we think God's love isn't able to be bigger than ours, I think we're delusional.
Yeah. What you were saying a little bit ago brings up some questions in that the canonical Gospels are always a question mark. Those other Gospels that we know existed, were they as truthful as the four that we acknowledge today? And we know some scholars say that John was written kind of as a refutation to Thomas, which was written prior, but Thomas was beyond John in theology in some ways, and so it was a refutation. All those, the books that are in what we call the canonical Gospels, I notice that you've dropped some of them out, the epistles, but were the other Gospels as valid, and Jesus just chose not to consider that during this particular period because we as a society accept this as the New Testament and that's what we're working with?
I think some of them are as valid as what we have, and I think He will work with those other Gospels. But I think the New Testament that will be published shortly is a bridge for those who have the New Testament that we consider divinely inspired, and obviously most of it is, but to get to the other epistles or Gospels, yes, I think so. And if you read John, Thomas, there's nothing negative in John about Thomas. No. They were good friends. And there's a lot of theology that's similar between the two.
I found that too. I couldn't find how this argument between the two could be because they seem so compatible.
Yes, but people always... Controversy sparks news these days rather
right.
than the truth.
Yeah.
One of the important things about the New Testament decision on the canonical books is that Constantine didn't want anyone thinking they were God, because Constantine was God, and to have another person be God was usurping his position, and I wouldn't call him a humble man, and he didn't want anything that implied that. He couldn't get rid of John's gospel because John was one of the apostles. But he could get rid of some of the Gnostic gospels because they were already sort of colored by the church itself not wanting the teaching of Jesus to be continued. There are places in the East where Jesus is teaching of our deification, of our becoming God. It's always been there. When I found out that Jesus' main teaching was that we are God, I thought I had been given something new. And it wasn't until reading John Sanford's book on John that he talked about deification being the teaching of Jesus, and that continues in the East in some churches. It's not considered orthodox these days. We're in the very odd position of Jesus' main message not being considered orthodox.
And Jesus sees this as a time that centrality of his teaching can come to a greater fruition, can come to a greater blossoming than it ever has in history. That's why he's making this overture and this opening up now.
Yes. A lot of traditions talk about this time. The Mayan calendar talks about it. The Hindu religion talks about in the Hindu religion we're at the curve, the symbolic going out from God, and now we're on the going back to God. It's sort of like a heartbeat. So that there is a radical transformation happening throughout the cosmos. I've been told that a tragedy a number of years ago led to a deep wounding of the human spirit on this planet, and that most of our problems is suffering from what I would call in modern psychological terms PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. People who have gone through war, for example, come back to this country, and they're wounded, they're hurting, they're struggling to be the kind of person they want to be. Mandela from South Africa was one of those giants who could be persecuted in tragedy for decades and come out with still having an open heart. Most of us can't do that, and a lot of what we see in our culture today comes from the fear that comes from tragedy. I live close to Joplin, Missouri, which was just devastated, and fear there is rampant now, and that has gotten in between the message of love in ourselves. John says, love drives out fear, and when fear gets in there, love has trouble getting through. But through a period of time, love always overcomes. Love is who we are. They say we have free will, but the one thing we're not free about is deciding that we are love, that we are God. We can't change that. You know, we can't change that reality.
Because that is our existence.
Yes, that's everything. And so during this time particularly, the fundamentalists would call this the last days, the last years, the last time, the last age. And I think that's true in the sense of it's the last of some of the things that we have been believing. Like there is a hell, that God gets upset when we sin, that we are sinners, when who we are as people who make mistakes because we're afraid, but that our core is love, and that love incarnates in service, which is what the message of Jesus is. And I think it can now get through to us again.
So you're saying in a sense that the New Testament is looking at those words that we know of Jesus and the life that we know of Jesus to the extent that we know it today, and getting rid of the debris, in order that it's not that it is the focal point of who we are, but that it tells who we are, and it allows us to get ready for other things. It will be, Jesus' message is going to come in additional ways, that it's not just the New Testament that we can look to. Is that, I know I'm not saying that right.
No, I agree. I have a friend who has a wonderful gift of knowledge, and I asked her about the New Testament, and she said, it's wonderful for today. And what she was saying was, it's a step, it's a bridge, but the revelation of God is going to continue, and there will be other steps and other glorious revelations that we can open to. Yeah, it's not. I think anything that's the Bible has to be a work in progress. You know, we're not talking about the past. We need to understand the past, but God always looks to the future.
It also brings along that other question about the Gospels and the epistles, and that who were their authors. The authors that are reputed to be the authors of the epistles, for example, and the Gospels, and is that sort of taken as accepted by your guides that helped you write this, or was there did they sort of address that subject too and say, well, it wasn't just this one, but it was all these other people, or it wasn't the Matthew we think of, but it was this other Matthew, or it was these epistles were not written by Paul, they were written by so and so. Did any of that come up, or was that considered somewhat insignificant compared to the message?
It never came up. What I talked about, John's Gospel, had come to me from John before I worked on the New Testament. And to get an understanding of that, Western people can't. Unless you're Eastern, you can't really understand Jesus, because for Jesus it wouldn't be a question, because he doesn't see other. He doesn't see two. He doesn't see this and that being this and that. There's a unity there. Like John and Jesus reached the point where they weren't other. They were just us.
I see.
There's a book many years ago, The Eye That Is We. And I think as we get closer to Jesus' message, everybody is we. You know, the barriers of race, of gender, of all of those things just fall away. And whatever we do to anybody, we do to ourselves. That's why all this hostility that's present today, people don't realize they're just manifesting their own pain. You know, they're talking about that person and trying to put them down. when really they're saying there's something in me that I don't like, but I can't deal with that. So I'm going to deal with that other. But Jesus says there is no other. It's always been just you and me. There's an old parable about the fellow that gets to heaven and sees Jesus there and looks around and there's nobody else. And he says, where are the others? And Jesus says, don't you realize it's just us? In the sense that it's just you, it's just, it's all one. There is no other.
When I talk to people about weddings and funerals and so forth, I meet a great array of people. They come from all different religions and cultures and philosophies, and they're quite secular, which I think is good. God's secular. And I often have people, due to the circumstances of what's put forward as, quote, Jesus and, quote, God, and what God expects and what God's rules are and so forth, that don't care for this God or this Jesus. So they often say to me, will you do this without speaking about Jesus? Will you not use his name? Will you not say God? And I often say, well, I won't say Jesus' name, but I'm going to tell you what he said, and you're going to like it. And I won't use God. I won't use the word God. I'll use the word love, because it's the same thing. Is that okay? And they all say that's okay. And so I think this message of Jesus, this core, is already known among Hindus and Buddhists and Jews and atheists and Christians and fundamentalists and liberals. It's already known because it's who we are. We breathe in this universe. In many respects, this New Testament brings all this grace and this love and this divinity completely in Jesus, because it was there. And he himself becomes the whole focal point into which we walk, as the text now says. We walk into him and we become him and we become this love. Is there a way in which Jesus is letting that be the entryway to that loving consciousness that we call God, that he just sees himself as the doorway? Or does he see himself as the one to which everyone must become him as Jesus, or him as the personification of all that is compassionate and life-giving and loving and kind? To what extent in the New Testament Jesus is central? He personally is central to it. To what extent is it him personally, or is it he standing for that fullness of God? If that's a good question. I don't know if it is or not.
Well, it points to a problem I had in writing the New Testament down. It came to the phrase, the Christ. Jesus is the Christ. And I was told, don't use use a. And I stopped at that. And I thought about that, and I thought, Jesus said that we are God, that we are Christ. So he is a Christ, not the Christ, in the sense that he is separate from us. And Jesus is so important because he taught us that we are Jesus, not in the sense of him, but in the sense of us, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's critical to understanding Jesus. For me, one of the things that helped my understanding of that was reading about the Hindus. The Hindus believe that anyone can become Christ. Last year, I read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. It's a very tough book to read for a number of reasons. One is that Sanskrit, which was the original, is a language that's specifically written to explain religious experiences to explain the core of our life, our divinity. And there are so many words in Sanskrit that don't exist in English. They don't exist in any of the Western languages. So you have so many words that have to be explained. So you have to keep looking at the glossary to find out what does this mean. Sri Ramakrishna in Hindu faith or is considered God. He considered himself a God, and to get closer to that understanding, he decided that since creation, as we call it, is a part of the divine, he wanted to experience every part of creation that he could. So he wanted to be rich, and he had a sponsor who gave him everything he wanted for a while. Then he decided that he wanted to be poor, and so he went without so many things. He even decided he wanted to be feminine and lived some time that way. He decided that he wanted to be Christian, and so he lived a time being that. In other words, to expand himself, the human that he was, to the divine that he is. And I think that's what Jesus calls us all to. Mm-hmm. He calls us brother. When Jesus calls you brother, he means brother. You are just like I am. You may not know that yet, and that's fine, but let me help you to get to the point where you can see me as brother and not as God. I remember where I was. I was in the infirmary. I was sick with hepatitis, and these thoughts were beginning to come up in me because I had been reading A Course in Miracles, and I was beginning to think that I was God, and I thought, well, I just need to say it. And it was the longest word in the history of the universe. I said, I am God. It just, my bones did not want to say that phrase. I just couldn't simply say, I am God. I couldn't get it out. My training, my belief system was so different that my body refused to follow my spirit saying, the truth is, I am God. And I think that's common among all of us. And particularly if God has been very distant, all-powerful. God is the God of everything, and we see 100 billion galaxies with 100 billion planets in each one of them, and we look up and we say, the person in charge of all of that.
The person in charge. There's our flaw, huh?
Yes.
The person in charge.
Yes, rather than the person that all of this is.
The inner brilliance of which we're a part.
Yes, yes.
That perspective. When you have to change that perspective, don't you?
Yes, and that perspective of unity is very hard for we Westerners.
Yeah.
The
only thing that can do it is when we love. That's the only way, isn't it, I think?
Yes, yes, and love transcends everything. And love doesn't use words to get it. Yeah. A hug can say 1,000 words.
Yeah.
And we need to remember that Jesus was an Easterner. Bethlehem, Jerusalem are not in the West. So to think that we can understand him with the Western mind just is impossible.
I have a friend, Timothy O'Connell, who says, all right, I'll say Jesus the Christ as long as we put Jesus, comma, the Christ, and Ken, comma, the Christ, and Jim, comma, the Christ, and Timothy, comma, the Christ, for all of us. Different way of saying the same thing you just said.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's important to remember. Everyone should think about, I am Christ. And when we get to believe that, then we will have heard Jesus' message. We will have heard the Hindu message and so many of the messages of the great religions of the world.
I think we'll stop for now and resume again in just a little bit.